Catherine Walker had been away from her hometown of Riverdale, Texas, for many years, serving in the Special Operations Command and training recruits in advanced combat tactics, but when she finally returned for a short visit to see her mother Mary Walker, she expected a quiet break filled with home-cooked meals, familiar sights, and the kind of peace that only a small southern town could offer. Yet Riverdale was no longer the calm and modest place she remembered from her childhood. The farmer's market, once vibrant with laughter, fresh produce, and the buzz of friendly conversation, had turned into a gloomy and fearful space where the vendors kept their heads low and spoke in whispers. Catherine immediately noticed that the energy was wrong. There was tension in the air, as if the whole market was suffocating under some unseen weight. She walked slowly down the main row of stalls, taking in the sight of her mother's booth where Mary was arranging baskets of fruit and vegetables, her face lined not only with age but with visible worry. Before Catherine could even greet her mother properly, the air was split by a booming voice that carried a threat wrapped in arrogance. Paul "Bull" Tanner, the notorious local gang leader who had spent the last few years tightening his grip on Riverdale, had arrived with a couple of his men. Bull was a hulking figure, broad-shouldered with a shaved head and a thick neck that made him resemble the animal whose nickname he carried, and his reputation for violence made him both feared and hated by the townsfolk. Catherine watched as he strode straight toward Mary's stall, knocking over a small crate with the tip of his boot just to see the tomatoes spill across the ground. His men laughed, and the sound was ugly in the stillness of the market. Bull leaned over Mary's counter, his voice low and menacing, demanding money for protection, and warning her what would happen if she dared refuse. The vendors nearby turned their eyes away, pretending to be busy, their silence bought by fear, their trembling hands betraying how accustomed they had become to this routine of extortion. Mary stood firm, her lips pressed tightly together, but Catherine could see the flicker of fear in her mother's eyes. That was enough to ignite the soldier inside her. Without hesitation, Catherine stepped forward, her boots hitting the pavement with purpose, her shadow falling over Bull's massive frame. "That's enough," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced down far worse than small-time criminals. Bull turned, his surprise evident, as if he couldn't comprehend that someone in this broken town would dare challenge him. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" he sneered, but Catherine didn't bother with introductions. Her training had taught her that words could sometimes be weapons, but in situations like this, action spoke louder. As Bull reached out a meaty hand, perhaps intending to shove her aside or worse, Catherine moved with lethal precision. Her arm shot up, catching his wrist, twisting it in a fluid motion that sent a sharp crack echoing through the market. Bull howled in pain, dropping to one knee as his men instinctively stepped forward, but Catherine's glare froze them where they stood. She pushed Bull's arm behind his back and forced him face down against the counter, her movements efficient, professional, the kind only a soldier with years of field experience could execute. Gasps rippled through the market. For the first time in years, people saw someone stand up to Bull and not only survive but dominate him. Mary's eyes widened with both fear and pride as she realized her daughter's presence had changed everything in an instant. Bull, gritting his teeth against the pain, spat out a curse and growled a promise of revenge. "You're gonna regret this, lady," he snarled, his face red with humiliation as Catherine finally released him, letting him stumble back into the arms of his stunned men. Catherine didn't flinch, she simply stood tall, her arms crossed, daring him to try again. The crowd remained silent, but beneath their shock, a spark of hope flickered, hope that maybe, just maybe, Bull's reign of terror wasn't unbreakable after all. Bull glared at Catherine one last time, his pride wounded deeper than his body, and then barked at his men to leave. They retreated, their footsteps heavy with frustration, their threats lingering in the air like smoke after a fire. Catherine turned to her mother, who was visibly shaken, and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "It's okay now, Mom," she said softly, though both of them knew this was only the beginning. Mary whispered urgently, "Catherine, you don't understand. He controls everything here, the police, the businesses, even the town council. You shouldn't have interfered. They'll come back, and they won't stop." Catherine's jaw tightened as she scanned the faces of the vendors around her. She saw men and women beaten down not only by poverty but by years of living under fear, their silence turned into survival. It made her blood boil. She had fought in distant countries to protect strangers, to uphold justice where others dared not, and now, in her own hometown, her people were prisoners in their own lives because of a thug like Bull Tanner. She wasn't about to let that stand. The market began to buzz with whispers, vendors cautiously murmuring about what they had just witnessed. For the first time in years, the bully had been humiliated, and it was at the hands of a woman no one recognized at first glance, but who had returned carrying the strength of battles fought far away. Catherine knew Bull would be back, and he would bring hell with him, but she also knew she had already crossed the point of no return. She couldn't just walk away now, not after seeing her mother threatened and her community broken. The first encounter had set everything in motion, and Riverdale, Texas, would never be the same again. The next morning Catherine woke early, hoping to share a quiet breakfast with her mother, but when she walked with Mary back to the Riverdale farmers market, she immediately felt the same oppressive atmosphere that had weighed on her the day before, only heavier now that her confrontation with Bull Tanner had rippled through the town. The market was supposed to be the heart of Riverdale, a place where families once gathered, where ranchers and farmers brought in fresh produce, where children laughed as they ran between stalls, and where neighbors exchanged recipes and gossip with a smile, but now it looked more like a ghost of its former self. The rows of stalls were open, but the vendors were subdued, moving sluggishly, avoiding eye contact, and speaking in hushed tones. Instead of the lively energy Catherine remembered, there was only the suffocating silence of fear. She could see it everywhere: men nervously stacking boxes of fruit while glancing over their shoulders, women pretending to haggle but lowering their voices whenever someone walked by, children kept close by their parents' sides rather than allowed to run freely. Even the air smelled different, like damp wood and stale dust, as though the spirit of the market had been drained away. Mary kept her head down as she arranged her goods, her voice barely above a whisper when she warned Catherine to be careful. "You don't understand what you've done, Katie," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she folded a paper bag. "Bull isn't just some street thug. He has the sheriff in his pocket, he's got judges, and the folks here, well, they've learned the hard way that nobody helps them. Last year, remember old Joe, the butcher? He tried to file a complaint after Bull's crew smashed his shop windows. They dragged him out of his own store at night, beat him so badly he spent weeks in the hospital, and nobody came to his defense. The sheriff called it a bar fight and closed the case. Everyone else understood the message: stay quiet or you're next." Catherine clenched her fists, anger tightening her chest as she listened, her eyes sweeping over the market. The faces she saw were worn and tired, not just from hard work but from years of living in submission. Every time Bull's crew walked through, the vendors would shrink back, handing over cash or goods just to avoid trouble. It was systematic, calculated intimidation, a stranglehold on the community's spirit. Catherine had seen villages overseas under warlords that looked more alive than Riverdale's market did now, and it made her sick. Mary leaned closer, her voice urgent. "You need to leave, Catherine. Take the next bus back to Austin or Dallas or wherever you came from. You don't belong in this fight. If you stay, they'll come after you, and they'll come after me too." Catherine shook her head slowly, her eyes steady. "Mom, I can't just walk away. Not when I see this. Not when I see you living in fear every day." Her words carried quiet conviction, but Mary's face only grew more worried. Around them, the vendors whispered among themselves, clearly aware of who Catherine was now. They had all seen her humiliate Bull Tanner the day before, and that act had spread through Riverdale faster than wildfire. Some whispered with awe, others with fear, and a few even with bitterness, because they knew what would come next. Bull wasn't the type to forgive humiliation, and his retaliation would be brutal. Catherine noticed an old man at a nearby stall who kept staring at her with cautious eyes. When she caught his gaze, he quickly looked away, pulling his hat lower, but not before she saw the faint flicker of hope buried deep in his expression. She understood what it meant: the people were desperate for someone to fight back, but they were too scared to do it themselves. For years they had lived under the shadow of Bull Tanner's crew, and survival meant obedience. Catherine's presence had cracked that shell of fear just a little, but it also put everyone at risk, because when a tyrant is challenged, he always strikes harder to remind people who holds the power. As the morning dragged on, the market operated in its muted rhythm. A few customers drifted in, buying small amounts of produce, but the vendors barely made eye contact, their voices mechanical. Catherine helped Mary with the stall, her soldiers' eyes scanning the area, watching every movement, every nervous glance, every sign of unease. She noticed that even when people exchanged money, they did it with their heads lowered, as if avoiding the invisible gaze of Bull himself. It wasn't just fear, it was submission ingrained into their daily lives. She thought about what her mother had said regarding the sheriff. If the law was compromised, if justice was twisted to serve criminals, then the people were truly trapped. Catherine had seen this play out overseas, villages paying protection to armed militias while corrupt officials looked the other way. She had never imagined she would come home to see the same rot spreading in her own backyard. Around noon, whispers spread through the market that Bull's men were circling nearby, watching from a distance, waiting for orders. Catherine kept her composure, but she could see how the vendors shrank even further into themselves, their hands moving faster, their conversations dying mid-sentence, their eyes darting nervously toward the street. The fear was palpable, thick in the air, infecting everyone like a disease. Mary gripped her daughter's arm and said under her breath, "Promise me, Catherine, promise me you won't push this any further. Let it go." But Catherine couldn't make that promise. Instead she placed her hand gently over her mother's and said, "I'll keep you safe. I swear it." The words were meant to reassure, but in truth they carried a deeper weight. Catherine had already decided that she would not let Bull Tanner's tyranny continue. The fear in the market wasn't just her mother's burden, it was the burden of an entire community, and Catherine knew that once she had stepped into the fight, there was no turning back. The silence of the market, the bent backs of its vendors, the whispered stories of broken bones and ruined lives, all of it burned into her heart like fuel for a fire that had only just been lit. That night, long after the last customer had left the Riverdale farmers market and the vendors had packed up their unsold goods, Catherine Walker sat at the old wooden kitchen table in her mother's modest house, staring at her phone. The silence in the house was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Mary had already gone to bed, exhausted by the day, but Catherine couldn't sleep. Her mind kept circling back to the look on Bull Tanner's face when she had forced him to the ground, the sound of his men's laughter turning into stunned silence, and the way the entire market had frozen in shock. She knew Bull's humiliation wouldn't be left unanswered. Men like him thrived on fear and intimidation, and when their power was challenged, they struck back twice as hard. The image of her mother trembling at the stall that morning made Catherine's decision for her. She wasn't going to fight this war alone, not when she knew exactly who she could call. With a deep breath, she scrolled through her contacts until she found the names she hadn't needed in years, names tied to memories of desert heat, gunfire in the dark, and missions that blurred the line between life and death. The first number she dialed belonged to Jim Carter, her old teammate from Sockham, a brawler with a heart of gold and fists like iron. Jim had been a close-quarters combat specialist, the kind of soldier you wanted at your back when the fight got up close and personal. Catherine remembered his booming laugh and the way he used to say that a good punch could solve problems faster than a bullet. When his voice finally answered, rough and deep, it carried the same energy she remembered. "Walker. Damn, I haven't heard from you in years. What's going on?" She hesitated for only a second before laying it out plainly, the corruption, the gang, the stranglehold over her hometown. There was a pause on the other end, then a low chuckle. "Sounds like you're stirring up trouble again. Where do you need me?" Relief washed through her. Jim didn't need persuasion, didn't ask if it was dangerous, only asked where and when. The second call went to Mike Reynolds, their unit's tech wizard, a hacker who had once broken into an enemy network while bullets were flying overhead. Mike had always been the brains of the team, calm under pressure with a knack for turning technology into a weapon as powerful as any rifle. These days he worked in cybersecurity for a private firm in Dallas, living in a sleek apartment surrounded by glowing screens. When he picked up, his voice was dry with sarcasm, but she could hear the eagerness underneath. Well, Catherine Walker. Last I heard, you were making recruits cry in training. What's dragged you back into the mud? She explained quickly, giving him the details of Bull Tanner's operation, the corrupted sheriff, the frightened townsfolk. Mike whistled softly. Sounds like small-town America at its finest. You know this isn't going to be legal, right? Catherine's reply was steady. Since when did we ever wait for permission? He laughed. Fair enough. Send me the files you've got, and I'll start digging. If this guy's as dirty as you say, I'll find the evidence. Count me in. The third call was the hardest, not because she doubted the outcome but because Drew Collins was the quietest of the group, the one who had always carried the weight of their missions more heavily than the rest. A former combat engineer, Drew was a man of few words but immense strength, steady as a rock under fire. After leaving the service, he had returned to civilian life and opened a small martial arts gym, teaching kids discipline and self-defense, trying to build something good out of the chaos he'd survived. When he answered, his voice was low and calm. Catherine. It's been a long time. She told him everything, and when she finished, there was a silence so long she thought maybe he was going to refuse. But then he said simply, "Where do you want me?" That was all. No hesitation, no questions, just quiet loyalty. By the time she hung up, Catherine felt a sense of resolve settle over her. Her team was coming. Not the full squad they once had, but enough. The people she trusted with her life were willing to stand with her again. She walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street of Riverdale. It was late, and the town slept uneasily, its people resigned to another day of fear under Bull Tanner's rule. But soon, things would change. She knew Bull would come at her with everything he had, but he didn't know who he was really up against. Catherine wasn't just one woman, she was the tip of a spear forged in war, and now that spear would be aimed at him. The following evening, headlights cut through the dark as a pickup truck rolled into town, Jim Carter stepping out with his broad grin and massive frame. He hugged Catherine like a brother, clapping her on the back hard enough to knock the wind out of her. Hell, Walker, I've been itching for a good fight. Let's show this bastard what happens when he picks the wrong town. An hour later, Mike Reynolds arrived, his laptop bag slung over his shoulder, already muttering about firewalls and encrypted channels. He wasted no time setting up shop in Mary's small living room, his fingers flying across the keyboard as streams of data filled his screens. And then Drew Collins came, quiet as always, carrying only a duffel bag of gear and the calm presence of someone who had already made peace with what needed to be done. Together, the four of them sat around the kitchen table, just like old times, maps spread out, notes scribbled, strategies forming. They talked about Bull Tanner's known hangouts, the bars he owned, the warehouse on the edge of town where his crew gathered, the routes they used to move money and drugs. Mike pulled up satellite images, hacked into traffic cameras, and began tracing connections between Bull and local officials. Jim polished his brass knuckles and joked about knocking some sense into the sheriff. Drew sat silently, listening, analyzing, his steady eyes fixed on Catherine as if to remind her that whatever path she chose, he was with her. Catherine looked at each of them and felt the weight of the past lift slightly from her shoulders. They weren't in uniform anymore, and this wasn't an official mission, but it felt the same, a small unit preparing to take on an enemy larger than themselves, armed with nothing but skill, loyalty, and the certainty that they couldn't turn away. Outside, Riverdale slept in fear, but inside Mary's little house, something powerful was forming, something that Bull Tanner had never faced before. For the first time in years, Catherine felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The storm began sooner than anyone expected. Bull Tanner was not a man to lick his wounds quietly, and the humiliation Catherine had inflicted on him in front of the entire market had cut too deep. Within 48 hours his retaliation swept across Riverdale like a brushfire, burning everything in its path, and Catherine's worst fears for her mother and the townspeople began to unfold before her eyes. It started with intimidation, loud trucks rumbling through the neighborhoods at midnight, their engines growling as men shouted threats into the darkness, baseball bats slamming against fences and mailboxes, spray-painted warnings scrawled across storefronts, "Stay quiet or else." Windows shattered in the middle of the night, dogs poisoned, locks broken. The sheriff's office didn't lift a finger. In fact, Sheriff Colin's no relation to Drew showed up at the market the next morning with his deputies, not to arrest the vandals but to inspect permits, threatening fines and closures for the very people who were already victims. Mary Walker's stall was singled out, the sheriff warning her that she was in violation of health codes despite her spotless record. Catherine stood nearby, her jaw clenched, barely restraining herself from knocking the smug look off his face. She knew he was nothing but Bull's puppet, a badge used as a weapon against the innocent. That same day Jim Carter intercepted one of Bull's crew outside a hardware store, a lanky thug named Ricky Malone who strutted around town with a pistol tucked into his waistband and a sneer that dared anyone to challenge him. Jim caught him shaking down an elderly farmer, demanding money for protection. Without hesitation Jim stepped between them, his massive frame blocking Ricky's path. "You got business with this man?" Jim asked, his voice casual but laced with threat. Ricky sneered. "Yeah, I do. You want to make something of it?" Jim's smile was broad and dangerous. "Glad you asked." The punch landed before Ricky even saw it coming, a clean right hook that knocked him flat onto the concrete. When Ricky scrambled up, Jim hit him again, harder this time, sending him sprawling into the side of a pickup truck. By the time Ricky's buddies showed up, Catherine was already there, her movements sharp and precise as she disarmed one, twisted his arm behind his back, and slammed him against the truck bed. Drew Collins, silent but relentless, moved like a shadow, tossing another thug onto the ground with brutal efficiency. Within minutes the crew scattered, dragging Ricky away, shouting that Bull would make them pay. The farmer tried to thank them, but Catherine shook her head. "Stay safe. Keep your head down. This isn't over." She knew every small victory was also a warning to Bull that she wasn't backing down, and that meant escalation was inevitable. That night Mike Reynolds delivered proof of just how deep the rot went. Sitting in front of 3 glowing monitors in Mary's living room, he tapped into bank records, traffic cams, and police reports, tracing the flow of money from local businesses into shell accounts tied to Bull Tanner's name. He showed them how Bull laundered drug profits through his bars, how the sheriff received donations funneled through fake community projects, how city council members looked the other way in exchange for envelopes stuffed with cash. "This town isn't just afraid," Mike said grimly. "It's bought and paid for." Catherine leaned over his shoulder, studying the maps and charts he pulled up. Each line, each arrow, was another chain wrapped around Riverdale's throat. "Then we break the chains," she said quietly. "One at a time." The following days were a blur of tension and skirmishes. Bull's men patrolled the market openly, knocking over crates of fruit, stealing from vendors, daring anyone to stop them. Catherine and her team answered with precision. Jim became a constant presence, standing guard at Mary's stall like an immovable wall, his sheer size deterring most would-be harassers. Drew trained a group of local teenagers in basic self-defense at the back of the gym, giving them confidence they had never felt before. Mike worked from the shadows, spreading anonymous leaks online, exposing snippets of Bull's corruption to stir whispers beyond Riverdale. But the more Catherine pushed back, the harsher Bull's counterattacks became. One evening, flames lit up the night sky as a small grocery store owned by a family who had quietly supported Catherine was set ablaze. The fire roared through the wooden building, reducing it to ash before the fire department could arrive. The family stood on the sidewalk in tears, clutching each other while Bull's men watched from a distance, smirking. Catherine stood with them, her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. She promised the family they would rebuild, but inside she felt the pressure mounting. Bull wasn't just sending a message, he was waging war. Things escalated further when Mary herself became a target. Returning home one afternoon, Catherine found the front porch torn apart, windows smashed, and a dead crow nailed to the door with a crude note scrawled in red paint, "Next time it's her." Mary tried to put on a brave face, insisting she wouldn't abandon her daughter, but Catherine saw the fear in her eyes and it fueled her rage. "He wants to scare us into running," Catherine told her team later that night, her voice cold and steady. "But we're not running. Not now, not ever." Jim slammed his fist onto the table. "Then let's take the fight to him. Stop waiting for him to come at us, make him bleed." Drew nodded silently, while Mike adjusted his glasses, already pulling up schematics of Bull's warehouse on the edge of town. "If you're serious, we'll need to hit him where it hurts: his money, his stash, his reputation. Take that away, he's nothing but a thug with a loud mouth." Catherine looked at each of them, seeing the fire in their eyes, the same fire that had burned in deserts and jungles overseas. They weren't soldiers anymore, but the bond was the same, and the mission was clear: strike first, strike hard, and show Riverdale that Bull Tanner was not untouchable. Outside, the night was heavy with tension, the town holding its breath as if waiting for the next blow. But inside Mary's house, the team sharpened their resolve. Bull had unleashed his first wave of counterattacks, spreading fear through intimidation, violence, and fire. Now it was Catherine's turn to answer, and she would answer with the full force of a soldier who had fought and bled on battlefields far harsher than anything Bull Tanner could imagine. She wasn't just fighting for her mother anymore. She was fighting for Riverdale itself, and she had no intention of losing. The war in Riverdale no longer hid in the shadows, it seeped into every corner of the town, turning ordinary routines into battlegrounds and neighbors into cautious watchers of one another, unsure who was loyal to Bull Tanner and who secretly prayed for Catherine Walker and her team to succeed. Bull's men roamed the streets with more aggression, their black trucks parked outside shops as if marking territory, their laughter sharp and cruel whenever they intimidated a store owner into handing over cash. The sheriff's deputies patrolled not to protect but to ensure compliance, making it clear that anyone who spoke against Bull would find themselves facing sudden fines, lost licenses, or worse. Yet under that suffocating grip, something was changing, something Catherine could feel each time she walked through the market beside her mother. The vendors who once lowered their eyes now risked quick glances at her, their fear tempered with a spark of hope, as if silently acknowledging that someone was finally fighting back. Catherine's presence, and the actions of Jim, Mike, and Drew, were starting to ripple outward, and ripples, she knew, could turn into waves. It began with small acts of defiance. A baker refused to pay Bull's collectors, citing that she was barely making ends meet, and though she trembled when they threatened her, she stood her ground long enough for Jim to step out of the shadows and make the thugs reconsider with a single glare. A mechanic quietly offered Drew his garage after hours, giving them a place to meet and stash supplies, muttering that he was tired of fixing cars that Bull's men wrecked just for fun. Mike noticed anonymous tips starting to hit his encrypted channels, residents willing to risk their safety by slipping him scraps of information about Bull's operations, warehouse locations, or suspicious movements of money. The fear was still there, but it was no longer absolute. The people of Riverdale were beginning to test their chains. Bull Tanner, however, was no fool. He knew power wasn't just about fists and guns, it was about crushing even the hint of rebellion before it grew. He escalated with brutality. One morning the market woke to find the old butcher Joe, the same man Mary had once mentioned, beaten again, this time left tied to a post in the center of town as a warning, his face swollen, his body broken. The sheriff called it gang violence, but everyone knew who had done it. Catherine stood in the crowd, rage burning in her chest, watching the townspeople avert their eyes as Joe was taken to the hospital. Bull wanted fear to tighten its grip again, but Catherine knew it also deepened the anger that was building quietly beneath the surface. That night the team gathered in the mechanic's garage, the smell of oil and rust mixing with tension. Maps spread across the workbench, Mike's laptop glowing with stolen data. "Bull's moving a shipment tomorrow night," Mike said, tapping at the screen where a series of numbers and addresses lined up. "Cash, drugs, maybe weapons. He's using the old freight yard at the edge of town. If we hit it, we can cripple his cash flow." Jim cracked his knuckles, grinning. Finally, something worth punching. Drew remained quiet, his eyes studying the map with that calm intensity that always made Catherine trust him most. "We'll need to be fast," he said. "In and out before his reinforcements arrive. If we can seize the shipment, we'll send a message." Catherine nodded, feeling the weight of command settle on her shoulders just as it had in foreign war zones. Only this battlefield was her hometown, and the civilians were people she loved. The next night they struck, moving like ghosts through the freight yard. Catherine led the way, her senses sharp, every shadow a potential threat. Jim flanked her, heavy boots silent despite his size, while Drew brought up the rear, steady and precise. Mike coordinated from a van parked nearby, his voice calm in their earpieces as he fed them live updates from hacked cameras. 2 guards by the east gate. Another pair near the loading dock. Move now. Catherine signaled, and within minutes the guards were down Jim's fists and Drew's chokehold silencing them before they could raise an alarm. They slipped into the yard, weaving between rusted freight cars until they reached the warehouse where trucks were being loaded. Inside they saw stacks of crates, bundles of cash, and drugs packed for distribution. Bull Tanner himself wasn't there, but his operation was laid bare. Catherine raised her weapon, steady and controlled, and whispered, "Let's shut him down." The fight was swift and brutal. Jim barreled into 2 thugs, dropping them with bone-crunching blows. Catherine disarmed another with a fluid strike, using his own momentum to send him crashing into a stack of crates. Drew moved methodically, every strike efficient, leaving enemies groaning on the ground. Alarms blared, trucks revved, and chaos exploded, but within minutes the team had seized control of the warehouse. Mike's voice cut in, "Cops are on the way, Bulls got them wired. You've got 5 minutes before they flood the place." Working fast, they torched the drugs, smashed open crates of cash, and loaded evidence into their truck. By the time sirens wailed in the distance, they were gone, leaving behind a blaze that lit up the night sky. The next morning Riverdale buzzed with rumors. People whispered about the fire at the freight yard, about Bull's losses, about how someone had finally struck back against him. The sheriff tried to spin it as rival gangs, but the townsfolk weren't convinced. They began to look around at one another differently, recognizing that Bull wasn't invincible, that his empire could bleed. For Catherine, it was both a victory and a warning. She knew Bull would come back harder, angrier, more dangerous than ever. But she also knew the tide was shifting. In the days that followed, Catherine and her team became shadows moving through Riverdale, striking and disappearing, unraveling Bull's operations piece by piece. They ambushed his men during collections, turning victims into witnesses. They spread leaked documents online, drawing attention from journalists outside the county. They sabotaged his trucks, cut off supply lines, and exposed his financial ties. Each move weakened him, but each move also painted a bigger target on their backs. Mary Walker watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and fear, knowing Catherine was lighting a fire that could either free Riverdale or destroy it completely. Bull Tanner, humiliated and enraged, unleashed his wrath. More buildings were vandalized, more innocents beaten, and threats grew bolder. Yet, despite the danger, whispers of resistance grew louder in Riverdale. Shopkeepers who once cowered began locking their doors in Bull's men's faces. A church opened its basement as a safe house. Farmers offered food to Catherine's team, murmuring blessings as they passed. Fear was still there, yes, but now it walked hand in hand with defiance. For the first time in years, Riverdale wasn't just surviving, it was fighting back. Catherine stood at the heart of it, battle-hardened, resolute, her team at her side. The hidden war was no longer hidden. It had spread into every street, every household, every heart, and there was no turning back. Bull Tanner would strike again, harder than ever, but Catherine was ready. She had been forged in wars far from home, and now she fought for the soul of her own town. Whatever came next, she knew this was only the beginning. The night the siege began, Riverdale felt like a town under occupation, the kind Catherine had seen halfway around the world in war-torn countries, only this time it wasn't foreign soldiers or militias but a gang led by one ruthless man determined to crush defiance at any cost. After weeks of losing money, losing shipments, and losing face, Bull Tanner had reached his breaking point, and instead of subtle intimidation or scattered retaliation, he unleashed everything he had in a full-scale assault designed to suffocate the town until it bent back under his control. His trucks rolled in at dusk, headlights glaring, engines growling like predators circling prey, parking at intersections and blocking roads. Men armed with shotguns and chains prowled openly, their boots echoing on the pavement as they stationed themselves outside stores, daring anyone to resist. For the first time in decades, Riverdale looked less like a community and more like a prison. Shops shuttered their windows before nightfall, families huddled inside with lights off, praying the chaos wouldn't reach their doorstep. Catherine, Jim, Drew, and Mike gathered at Mary's house, the atmosphere thick with tension. Through the curtains Catherine watched the patrols cruise by, her jaw tightening as she realized Bull wasn't just sending a message this time, he was trying to choke the life out of the town completely. "He's not playing anymore," Jim muttered, loading fresh rounds into a shotgun he'd picked up. "He wants to starve these people into silence." Mike's fingers flew across his keyboard, the glow of his screens lighting his worried face. "I'm tracking police radio chatter. The sheriff's in on it. He's telling deputies to stay out of downtown, says it's too volatile. That's code for letting Bull do whatever the hell he wants." Drew leaned against the wall, calm but grim. "This isn't intimidation. This is siege warfare." Catherine nodded, her voice steady though her heart burned with anger. "Then we treat it like a siege. We hold the line, keep the people safe, and hit back where it hurts." But as determined as they were, Catherine couldn't shake a gnawing unease. Bull Tanner had always been brutal, but he wasn't stupid. He had to know direct assaults would galvanize resistance instead of crushing it. That meant he had another card to play. The betrayal came from where she least expected. Late that night, as the team planned their next move in Mary's kitchen, headlights swept across the driveway and a familiar voice called from outside. It was Deputy Harris, a man Catherine had seen hanging around her mother's stall, pretending to offer protection, always with a polite smile. He had once seemed like the only decent cop in Bull's corrupted force, the kind who might secretly be waiting for someone brave enough to push back. Catherine stepped outside cautiously, her hand near her holster. Harris raised his hands, his face drawn tight with nerves. "I want to help," he said in a low voice. "I can't stand what Bull's doing anymore. He's planning something worse tomorrow night, something big. Let me in, and I'll tell you everything." Against her instincts but trusting her gut that Riverdale couldn't afford to turn away allies, Catherine brought him inside. He sat at the table, voice trembling as he described Bull's plan, an armed raid on the market itself, intended not just to intimidate but to burn it down completely, erasing the one place that still gave the town a sense of community. As he spoke, Catherine felt the weight of his words sink into her chest. If the market fell, Riverdale's spirit would be broken. Jim slammed a fist on the table, cursing. Drew's eyes narrowed, his silence more dangerous than any outburst. Mike was already sketching countermeasures on a digital map, plotting ambush points and escape routes. "We'll be ready," Catherine said firmly, placing a reassuring hand on her mother's shoulder. "They won't destroy this town, not while we stand." But what they didn't know was that Harris's betrayal was already in motion. While he sat at their table spinning his tale, his phone buzzed silently in his pocket, sending a signal to Bull's men, marking the very house where Catherine and her team were gathered. Minutes later the trap closed. Trucks roared down the street, headlights cutting through the night as dozens of men poured out, weapons glinting under the street lamps. The sound of boots and shouted orders filled the air. Bull Tanner himself stepped from the lead truck, his hulking frame silhouetted in the glow, his voice booming with cruel satisfaction. "Thought you could take me down, Walker? Thought you could rally this town against me? Tonight we end this." Gunfire erupted as his men surrounded the house. Windows shattered, walls splintered, and Mary screamed as Catherine pulled her to cover. Jim returned fire with explosive ferocity, his shotgun blasts booming through the night, each shot dropping a thug who dared come close. Drew moved with silent precision, dragging Mary to safety, his calm presence a lifeline amid the chaos. Mike shouted updates from his screens, hacking into street cameras to track enemy positions, relaying movements as though directing an invisible battlefield. The house shook under the onslaught, plaster raining down as bullets tore through walls. Catherine's mind raced, training taking over, every decision a calculation of survival. "We can't hold here," she shouted to the team. "We fall back, draw them out, hit them on ground of our choosing." Jim growled but nodded, covering their retreat with bone-rattling gunfire. Drew kicked open a back door, leading Mary into the alley, while Catherine moved like a shadow, dropping 2 attackers with swift, efficient strikes. Harris tried to slip away in the confusion, but Catherine caught his movement, her hand snapping to his collar. One look at his guilty eyes told her everything. She didn't waste words, only knocked him cold with the butt of her pistol before dragging him along. He would answer for what he'd done. They slipped into the night, the house burning behind them as Bull's men torched it, Mary's home consumed in flames. From the cover of darkness Catherine watched her mother's life reduced to ashes, her heart tightening with fury but her resolve hardening like steel. Bull wanted to break her, to break Riverdale, but all he had done was ignite a war that would not stop until one of them was finished. The siege spread into the following days, Riverdale transformed into a battlefield. Bull's men tightened their grip, blocking roads, cutting off supplies, spreading fear with open displays of violence. But Catherine and her team became phantoms in the chaos, striking at night, rescuing families trapped in their homes, ambushing patrols, leaving Bull's men battered and humiliated. Every move they made inspired more townspeople to resist, quietly passing along information, hiding supplies, whispering words of encouragement. Even as the sheriff issued statements calling Catherine a criminal and urging citizens to stay out of her rebellion, the people began to see the truth. She wasn't destroying Riverdale, she was fighting to save it. Yet the betrayal cut deep. Mary, shaken by the destruction of her home, clung to her daughter with fear in her eyes. "Katie," she whispered one night, "what if you can't win? What if all you're doing is making him angrier?" Catherine held her mother close, her voice steady. "I can't promise it'll be easy, but I can promise this: we will not stop until he's gone. This town deserves better. You deserve better." The siege and the betrayal had pushed Riverdale to its breaking point, but it had also revealed the truth of who Catherine and her team were. They weren't just soldiers or rebels, they were protectors, fighting not for orders or medals but for the soul of their home. And as the flames of Mary's destroyed house still smoldered in the distance, Catherine knew the final confrontation with Bull Tanner was drawing closer. There would be no hiding, no half-measures, no compromise. The war for Riverdale was about to reach its climax, and only one side would walk away. The final battle for Riverdale began on a night thick with the smell of smoke and the weight of silence, the kind of silence that falls when an entire town holds its breath, knowing that something decisive is about to happen. Catherine Walker stood at the edge of the burned foundation where her mother's house once stood, the ashes cold under her boots, the memory of fire still burning in her chest. Around her were the people who had come to believe in her, not soldiers in uniform but neighbors, farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers who had grown tired of bending their necks to Bull Tanner's rule. Some carried shotguns pulled from closets, others baseball bats or hunting knives, most carried nothing more than their own resolve, but their eyes were lit with a determination Catherine had not seen before. At her side, Jim Carter checked his weapon with grim satisfaction, Drew Collins stood steady and calm like a fortress in human form, and Mike Reynolds scrolled through feeds on his laptop, intercepting Bull's communications, his voice clipped with urgency as he relayed movements. "He knows you're gathering here," Mike said, tapping furiously at his keys. "Bull's men are coming in from 3 directions: north, east, and west. They want to trap you against the river. It's an all-or-nothing move." Catherine looked at the faces around her, the fear mixed with courage, the quiet defiance etched into lines of tired skin, and she spoke loud enough for all to hear. "Tonight we end this. For too long Bull Tanner has fed on your fear, your silence, your pain. But look around, hasn't one? You're still here. We're still standing. And if we stand together, he cannot break us." The murmurs of agreement swelled into shouts, the first real spark of unity Riverdale had felt in years, and Catherine knew the people were ready. They moved quickly, setting up barricades at the market square, using overturned trucks and farm equipment, hammering nails into boards, stringing chains across the street. The market, the very heart of Riverdale that Bull wanted to destroy, would become their fortress. Catherine and her team directed the defense with the precision of veterans, turning civilians into a militia. Jim stationed men at the barricades, teaching them how to hold their ground, his booming voice a pillar of confidence. Drew quietly placed others in vantage points, showing them how to stay calm under fire, reminding them that fear could be turned into focus. Mike patched into the town's power grid, rigging lights to cut on and off at his command, turning the darkness into a weapon. And then the storm came. The roar of engines filled the night, headlights blazing as Bull Tanner's convoy thundered into town. Dozens of trucks and motorcycles poured into Riverdale, packed with armed men shouting threats, their weapons glinting under the moonlight. At the head of it all was Bull himself, his massive frame standing in the back of a pickup, shotgun in hand, his face twisted with rage. He bellowed over the roar of engines, his voice carrying across the square. "This is your last chance. Give me Walker and her friends, or I'll burn this town to the ground." But no one moved, no one stepped aside. From behind the barricades the people of Riverdale shouted back, a sound that rose like thunder, a collective refusal that echoed down every street. Catherine stood tall on the barricade, her eyes locked on Bull's, and for the first time she saw hesitation in his gaze. He had ruled with fear his entire life, but tonight fear was no longer on his side. The first shots cracked through the night, bullets sparking against metal, and chaos exploded. The square lit up with gunfire, the barricades shuddering under the assault, but the defenders held firm. Jim roared as he fired, his massive frame unshakable, dropping attackers one by one. Drew moved with calm precision, pulling wounded civilians to safety and returning fire with lethal accuracy. Mike's voice filled their earpieces, directing fighters to weak points, shutting down streetlights to blind the enemy, cutting power to their radios so Bull's men were thrown into confusion. Catherine fought at the front, her every movement honed by years of combat, her strikes efficient, her aim steady, her presence a rallying point for the townsfolk who looked to her as both leader and protector. The battle raged for what felt like hours, the streets echoing with gunfire, shouts, and the screech of tires as Bull's men tried to breach the barricades again and again, only to be repelled by the combined will of a town that had finally found its courage. Flames licked at the edges of buildings, smoke curled into the sky, but still the defenders stood. Then came the moment Catherine had known would arrive, the confrontation with Bull Tanner himself. As the fighting pushed toward the center of the square, Bull leapt from his truck, swinging his shotgun like a club, his massive frame barreling through defenders as if they were nothing. He spotted Catherine and charged, his roar splitting the air. The crowd seemed to part around them, the chaos fading into the background as the two locked eyes, predator against predator. Bull swung first, the shotgun crashing through a wooden crate as Catherine dodged aside, her movements fluid, controlled. She struck back with a series of blows that staggered him, but his sheer size and fury absorbed the punishment. He caught her arm, yanking her close, his other hand clamping around her throat. "You should have stayed down, soldier," he snarled, spittle flying. Catherine gasped for breath, her vision blurring, but her training took over. She drove her knee into his ribs, twisted free, and slammed an elbow into his jaw. The crack echoed, and Bull stumbled, rage contorting his face. Around them the battle continued, but all eyes were drawn to the duel at the center of it all. Jim shouted encouragement, Drew held the line, Mike fed updates, but this was Catherine's fight alone. Bull lunged again, fists like sledgehammers, but Catherine slipped aside, her strikes precise, targeting his weak spots, every move fueled by the memory of her mother's fear, the cries of the townsfolk, the sight of Riverdale under siege. The fight was brutal, raw, a clash of will as much as strength, but little by little she wore him down, her endurance and discipline overwhelming his brute force. Finally, as he swung wide in desperation, Catherine caught his arm, twisted, and slammed him to the ground with a move drilled into her bones by years of combat. She pinned him, her knee on his chest, her weapon at his throat. The square fell silent, the people watching, holding their breath as the tyrant who had ruled them for so long lay defeated under the hand of the woman who had refused to bow. Catherine's voice was steady, her words cutting through the silence. "It's over, Bull. Riverdale doesn't belong to you anymore." For a moment he glared up at her, defiance flickering, but then his eyes darted around, seeing no reinforcements, no fear left to exploit, only the hard stares of a town that no longer trembled before him. His strength broke, and for the first time, Bull Tanner looked small. They dragged him away, not in chains of iron but in the unyielding grip of justice restored. The sheriff and his deputies, stripped of their power by Mike's evidence and the people's testimony, were arrested soon after, their corruption laid bare. Slowly, the fires were put out, the barricades dismantled, and dawn broke over Riverdale with a light that seemed cleaner, freer than it had in years. In the aftermath, the town gathered in the market square, scarred but unbroken, their faces lifted with something Catherine had not seen when she first returned hope. Mary Walker hugged her daughter tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks, whispering, "You brought us back, Katie. You gave us our town again." Catherine shook her head softly. "No, Mom. You all did this. You chose to fight." Jim laughed loudly, clapping Drew on the back, while Mike finally allowed himself a weary grin. The team had come together once more, not for medals or glory but for something far greater, the salvation of a community. As the sun rose higher, painting the sky gold, Catherine looked around at Riverdale, no longer a town of fear but a town reborn. She knew there would still be struggles ahead, scars that would take time to heal, but for the first time in years, Riverdale had its soul back. And as long as she lived, she would make sure no one ever tried to steal it again.